So, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me. First of all, can you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Well, hi Neil, I'm delighted to be here. I'm Rian-Marie Thomas. As you know me from my former life, where I spent 20 years working in banking, all of it at Barclays, most of it in investment banking before I moved on to roles in corporate banking and payments, and then latterly setting up the equivalent of a green bank within the organisation, and I'm sure we'll get onto that in a second. But for the last almost 2 years, I've been the chief executive of the Green Finance Institute, which I'm sure some of your audience haven't heard of. But we are a UK government-backed independent company focusing on mainstreaming green finance, both in the UK and globally.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, we're here to talk about leadership as much as what you're actually doing. I do want to hear about the Great Leadership Project. So I do want to hear about the Green Finance Institute, but I want to talk about leadership more than that. And I want to go back a little bit. Just to get to understand you as a person, what were your early years like, sort of school and home, and what were sort of early influences on you, do you think?
Um, I had a very happy childhood. Grew up in Wales, went to Welsh language school where there was a lot of emphasis on, well, on rugby, obviously, but on performing arts and non-academic achievements as well as academic achievements. And I think I was very fortunate in that I think it really emboldened many people to have a lot of self-confidence and self-belief. So I'm preempting some of your questions, Neil, because I know we're going to talk about leadership. You and I have spoken about this many times over the years and the need for leadership to drive change and be agents of change. And I was just thinking about some stories from when I was little. And my father, my late father, was an economist who was very knowledgeable about what you now call megatrends, but explained to us when we were kids about the ozone hole and the greenhouse gas. And so our family cut down on red meat in the very early 80s because of what was happening in the rainforest. And my father would never drive a car if there was a bus that went in the same direction. Even though he was a very respected professor. And now that wouldn't seem such a strange thing, but at the time that was quite radical. But the story that really sticks with me was early 80s, was a time of obviously apartheid in South Africa. And my mother would make a big fuss in the supermarket if there were fruits that were from South Africa and there were no other fruits to have, and would make sure she made the point to some poor checkout cashier or manager that we weren't buying any oranges or apples that week because they only had South African. And now there are other reasons why you wouldn't want to buy those fruits out of season, obviously. But at the time, you know, obviously mortified as a kid that mum would be making such a fuss. But I think looking back, um, all those examples, even though they were small, they emboldened both my sister and I to realize that we could be agents of change, even in the small changes that were within our own mandate to try and affect. And I think that's quite an important life lesson, rather than assuming that change is something that's done to you and that you have no personal agency.
And
And
also that must have given you a very strong ethical framework as well.
I guess so, yeah. Which then led me into banking. So maybe we'll draw a line into that.
Well, okay. So what stage do you think your career really got going?
Do you know, I've enjoyed every aspect of my career, but I think I really found my purpose. And this sounds a little bit cheesy, but I just had a real personal epiphany after the Paris Agreement was signed. So that was sort of back in 2015, ratified 2016. And you know, that was when it occurred to me and many, many other people that if all these countries were actually, all these governments were going to actually maintain these commitments to lower their emissions, then that was going to fundamentally change industrial strategy. And as a banker, I realized that there was going to be huge first mover advantage in being able to support our clients through this transition that none of them had ever been through before. That was going to be based on science, but otherwise based on assumptions about a future that none of us can extrapolate or genuinely predict with much confidence. And that was just a huge opportunity. So I think that was when I suddenly realized I was going to be able to use my, at that point, 16 years of banking experience, and bring it to bear on something that ever since I was a kid had been personally important to me, which was protecting the environment and worrying about climate change.
Okay. And so what did you do about it?
So very practically, I started going to conferences. I remember one in particular was on. I just started informing myself, basically, just trying to understand what was out there, what was happening. And I went to the Economist Sustainable Finance Conference, and it was just such a revelation. There were all these people there talking about sustainable finance and climate finance, and as ridiculous as that sounds, I wasn't even aware that was a thing. And I met one particularly charismatic venture capitalist who'd set up one of the biggest environmental technology funds in the UK. We got on like a house on fire, so I approached him and over lunch suggested that he might want to give me a job. And which he laughed at and said, of course he wasn't going to give me a job because I didn't have any equity investing experience and no track record in environmentalism. So why would he give me a job? But he also gave me some really helpful advice, which was, at this point I was the chief commercial officer at Barclaycard, and reporting up to the chief exec of Barclaycard. And he said, why don't you use the platform that you've developed for yourself within, one of the world's systemically important banks, figure out what they're doing on this agenda and figure out how you can help further it and how you can help it. So I took his advice, got in touch with some fantastic people who were doing some great work, but hadn't at that point really made the linkage between the need to look at this otherwise CSR type agenda through the profit lens. Like, if this was going to become a mainstream activity for an important bank like Barclays, it needed to be something that made money for the organization and that could compete with the other products and services that we were providing our clients. And that's where it started, really. I just felt really inspired by the whole thing and started with a small group initially, setting up a green banking council. So just exploring what was the art of the possible. What sort of products could we develop? What sort of things did our clients have an appetite for? And then that just kind of snowballed. I think there were about 200 of us involved at some point, delivering products, including the first ever green mortgage by a UK high street bank, the first green bond that was issued by a bank backed by UK assets. I think we were the first to do green corporate deposits in the UK. And so it goes on, and that might sound like an example of, trying to make out that I was some sort of heroic leader, but that was far from the case. There was just so much enthusiasm and energy and creativity within the organisation to do this, and all it needed was a bit of air cover.
Let's move on to talk about leadership. What do you think the role of leadership is in the world today?
I think, and I know you and I've talked before about the mega trends, of which decarbonisation and climate is obviously huge, but we've obviously got digitalisation and ageing as some of the others, and urbanisation as some of the others. And I think the role of leadership is to navigate all this change and volatility and ensure that you're bringing all your stakeholders with you. And that is actually a really tricky skill, because the vast majority of people are quite fearful of change for good reason, because they don't know what it will mean. And a great leader is somebody that it's a privilege to follow, even though aspects of their vision might be slightly, well, the aspects of their vision haven't been fully articulated yet. So I think that's the role of leadership, helping us navigate all this change.
And what's your attitude and approach to leadership? How do you do it?
How do I do it? I don't know. My attitude towards leadership is one of observing others and trying to emulate what I see as good leadership. And I've been amazingly fortunate in my career to have worked for some spectacular bosses. And I often do that exercise when I see people who I admire doing things well, is almost to step out of the present and try and observe what it is that's making the big impression. You know, why is it that I feel so inspired by what this person is saying? Or why do I feel, right, I want to throw my CV at someone and say, take me, I'll follow you wherever you want to go. So what are they doing in that moment that is so impressive, that brings you along? And that enables me to I know as an individual that enables me to bring my best self to work. So I hope, and I know I'm still on a huge journey of learning to do this, that my leadership style brings some of those elements that I've observed in others, to try and empower the people that work for me these days or work with me these days, to bring their best selves to work as well.
Can you give us some examples of who your role models for leadership are, and what did you learn from them?
I've got quite a long list actually, Neil, so I'll try and go with some of the characteristics that I've observed that have really resonated with me. The best leaders that I've worked for are always very self-aware. So I'm remembering one of my very first bosses, who was a kind of Alex Ferguson type character from Manchester United, right? Didn't suffer fools, got the best out of his team, and it was a privilege to work for him. But he realized he wasn't the most empathetic character, and so he surrounded himself with a couple of lieutenants who were, they were the ones that would come and say, "Ooh, you're in a bit of trouble, let me help you." And it was a fantastic triumvirate, actually, that really got the best out of a team and made us very, very successful. So I think being self-aware is one. Another, and I think quite related trait, is listening. So even the most visionary leaders, even though the people that I felt they knew all the answers, would always listen and take on new ideas on board. Which I think is so important, going back to my point about being able to navigate change. I think there's a saying, I don't know who said it, but it really resonated with me a while ago, which was leaders that don't listen will eventually be surrounded by people who have nothing to say. And you clearly can't lead in that situation, can you? Because it becomes your mono-vision, and everything we've learned about diversity and the need for getting away from groupthink suggests that just having one mono-vision isn't going to get you where you need to go. So people that listen. And then I think the third thing is a fantastic leader gives you that safe space and encourages you to take risk in the full knowledge that they've got your back. That if it does go wrong, provided you've tried your best, provided you did your due diligence and you didn't do anything foolhardy, they will back you up if perhaps it doesn't quite go to plan. And that is the most empowering thing a leader can do for those that are working with them. Make sure they're creating that environment.
Love that. So, I mean, in our language, self-awareness, completely agree with you. Listening, totally agree with you. And we would say psychological safety. So they create an environment where it feels safe to take risks, to experiment, to challenge the status quo, whatever it might be. Yeah. Love that. When you're confronted with a problem, how do you approach it? How do you think about it? And have you got any examples you can share?
I think with problem solving, so before I started embarking on this whole banking career, a finance career, I studied physics and have a doctorate in low temperature magnetism. And I think either science teaches you this or science appeals to you because you're already predisposed to doing this. But I genuinely believe in breaking problems down into very small component parts. And once you've broken them down into the smallest possible parts, most of the time you know the answers to each little bit. But then if there's a little bit that you don't quite know how to answer, there's always somebody else you can ask. And I'm never afraid of asking. And so I'm very fortunate to have a very extensive network of very generous and smart people who I know I can get in touch with and say, I don't want you to solve the whole problem for me, but here's just one small element that I'm stuck on. Could you help me with that? And quite often that unlocks the whole. So it's very much a reductionist way of solving problems, and then not being afraid to ask other people for help. I think that's something that I've learned quite late in my career. Rather than trying to answer everything myself, it's just like, go and ask. Most people are very keen to help others.
Lovely. There's a joke I like to use in sessions, which is when I was at school, people had a different name for collaboration. Do you know what they called it?
Cheating. I don't know.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, but it's true, isn't it? We were taught to do stuff on our own.
Yes, I guess that's true.
We weren't taught to collaborate. And actually, you're not alone. Most people I work with have, it's only recently that they've learned that you can ask. You can always ask. There's always someone. So on that point, what kind of collaborators and partners do you seek, and how do you choose the right ones, as it were?
Oh, that's such a pertinent question given what we're trying to do, right? So we are, the team at the Green Finance Institute that I head up now are pretty much all former bankers. So we're led by bankers, but we're financed by government, and our role is to act as that bridge between the policymakers and the mainstream financial providers. So our entire raison d'etre is about collaboration, because going back to the point I made earlier about we're having to figure out how industry, how policy, and how finance responds to decarbonisation and a net zero world that no one has yet fully defined. The only way you can solve that is by collaborating. And because none of us have got enough knowledge on each other's topics, so we have to find ways of bridging those conversations. So the way we collaborate at the Green Finance Institute is we deliberately set up coalitions. We pick real economy outcomes like decarbonisation of homes, like deploying more capital into middle income countries in Africa. And we bring all the people around the table that could possibly have expert knowledge in that area to help us co-design the solutions so that they are very much evidence-based and market-led. So that's all we do all day is collaborate. How do we select the people who we collaborate with? We select people who are doers. There's an awful lot of sucking of teeth when it comes to the challenges around decarbonisation, and a lot of, oh, well, that's very difficult. Yes, that's very tricky. And we are naturally drawn to the people that come in and say, what you're describing is really difficult, Rian, but I've had this idea and I've been struggling to get it to stand up for the last few years. And then you're like, oh, you're in the tent.
That's a very great filter. I love that. Just going back to leadership for a moment, do you have a leadership role model? Do you have any sort of leadership heroes?
Right now, my leadership role model is an absolutely fantastic woman called Emma Howard-Boyd, who chairs the Environmental Agency. She previously used to work in investment management, but now is one of the most senior civil servants in the country, and one of the founders of the 30% Club, which I'm sure many of your viewers are already very familiar with. I've never met anyone who is as selfless as she is, despite the incredible demands of her job, in supporting others and trying to assist particularly other women succeed in their goals. And even though I know how rigorous and how hard her job is, she always manages to find time for me, for others, and always does it with a smile on her face. And honestly, she's the most energizing person I know. Extraordinary.
Interesting. So can we add selflessness to the list?
Maybe that's it. Yeah, maybe that's part of it, or generosity at least, right?
Well, and actually, so again, to put it into our language, I mean, we make this distinction between boss-style leaders who are primarily motivated by status and authentic style leaders who are primarily motivated by purpose. And so actually, when you say selfless, I mean, actually, maybe she's just very purpose driven. And I mean, basically anyone who's sort of collaborating with her on that purpose, she's going to support them massively.
And I'm really fortunate in this role that I have, in that there are so many people, pretty much everybody I deal with every day are very purpose-led individuals. They recognize that climate risk is financial risk, and that we actually need to change the way that, and change the purpose of how we conduct ourselves in finance. So I have a long list of extraordinary people who genuinely put that purpose ahead of their personal status. It's a real pinch yourself moment quite often, especially on Zoom, where we have access to so many people around the world, that I get to be on calls with people who have been my heroes for such a long time, and get to understand how they think and how they're looking at stuff. But nearly always the thing that's impressive about them is it's not about them. It's about, I hate to say the cause, but it's about...
Yeah, no, but it is a cause, isn't it?
But it is a cause, but it's about outcomes. It's about trying to solve a really wicked problem and using all their skills to do that.
I mean, just to sort of go a bit narrower on that, are there any specific examples of great leadership that you've seen from that?
Well, obviously, Paul Polman at Unilever, just an extraordinary person. John Elkington at Volants, again, just an extraordinary thinker and somebody who's amazing to spend time with. Christiana Figueres, who may not be such a household name, but she was, one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. And again, just an extraordinary individual. And I could go on. All of these people, the fact that they find time to support others and share their knowledge and their experience, it's incredibly inspiring.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about the list that you just gave, and also our views on leadership, is the requirement, or the requirement to be willing to make yourself vulnerable, to take steps that other people find scary, and put yourself in that position and say, no, this is the right thing to do. Will you come with me on this journey? It strikes me that list of people that you're talking about, and probably many others, are one of the other characteristics is their willingness to be vulnerable in pursuit of the cause. Do you see that?
I'm just thinking about, and this is a story that he's told in the public domain, I guess a few times, but Paul Polman saying about his first day as chief exec at Unilever, when he decided to announce they'd no longer be publishing quarterly earnings, because he didn't feel that was in the best interest of long-term sustainable strategy. And in his words, he assumed they wouldn't fire him on his first day. So he thought that was the best day to make an announcement like that. But what incredible vulnerability, having achieved, such an aspirational role to be the chief executive of a company like Unilever, and then using that platform to do something that could get you fired. Wow.
Yes. Well, exactly. And yes, exactly. I mean, that willingness to take that step into the unknown because you believe in something, because you believe in that cause, that purpose.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of great leadership, I think.
I think that vulnerability and that willingness to know you will walk away from your role if it's not right. I've admired so many people for doing that, sort of, maybe not sort of Paul Polman's status in the world, but just people that I've worked with day to day who've just gone, do you know what, this doesn't sit right with me anymore. I'm going to try and do something else. And I admire them immensely, because that takes such self-belief that you will still land on your feet.
Well, and of course that's sort of another topic, isn't it? Because there's one part of this which is leadership, and there's another part of it which is self-leadership. Yes. And that making sure that you're doing the thing that you believe in, that you feel passionate about, that's self-leadership. And then taking the organization or the team or whatever it is, taking everyone else in the right direction, that's the leadership bit.
But I think those two things have to be so interlinked, Neil, because if you're going to conform, especially in sort of more conventional settings, because you're so afraid of making yourself vulnerable, or you're so afraid that, you know, it doesn't matter how unhappy you get in your role, you're just going to stay there. Or, you know, let's be clear, this is a fairly privileged conversation, isn't it? A lot of people have to stay in their roles because they have no other options. But that ability to lead really authentically and drive change, there does need to be a little bit of, well, and if this doesn't work out, too bad, I'll try it somewhere else. There does need to be a little bit of that, right?
Yeah, totally. At what stage do you think one becomes a leader?
I don't know. I'm going to give the glib answer, which is as soon as you have somebody following you, I guess. Otherwise, you're not leading anyone, are you, or leading anything? Yeah, I suppose that's...
I think that's a totally legit answer. I mean, the followership has to define leadership. Without followers, you can't be a leader, of course. But it's interesting that I think implicit in your answer is the point about it's a choice rather than an appointment.
I guess it can. Well, yeah. I mean, we all know, and I'm sure we've all had experiences of people who have been put into senior positions, and sadly, they're not leaders. They might be great managers or great, good at output, but they're not very good at inspiring others to help execute their vision. So they're not really leaders. Whereas I'm just thinking about someone in my team at the moment. She's in her early 20s, and she leads a coalition of over 300 members. She is the definition of a leader.
Fantastic. Love that. So yes, it's not necessarily about appointment. It's not necessarily about seniority. It's about a willingness to ask questions and challenge people to follow.
And inspire people to follow. I think giving them that sense of courage that they themselves are empowered to be leaders and execute on the leader's vision.
So that idea of encouragement, literally giving people courage to go beyond what they think they can do, to take them to the next level, to achieve something. I love that. Are you a leader?
Well, I guess I am by appointment. I guess I am by appointment, and I hope I am also in the way I conduct myself. I like I say, I do try and emulate what I've seen others do, and try and make sure that I'm empowering the team. Nothing makes me happier actually than seeing my team when it's in full flow. Like sometimes even over the Zoom, we have to have, these whiteboarding sessions where, one of the directors has come to me and says, I'm really struggling with something. And I said, well, why don't we ask the rest of the team to try and help us find the answer? This person's got a little bit of experience in that, or this person's already had a similar situation. And then I just sit back and watch them solve it between them. That is amazing. And that's the incredible privilege of being the chief exec of a startup, is that you can focus on getting those people into your organization that thrive in that kind of environment. And honestly, that nothing makes me happier than to see that. So if that's what makes me a leader, then I think I'm going to sign up for it.
Okay, so here's a sort of more global challenge. So within the Great Leadership Project, we're keen to educate people about leadership and what leadership really is. And one of the challenges is that very often it's the people who need to be leaders most that end up leading. they need it from a status point of view, from a psychological point of view. They put themselves forward, they navigate their way into positions of leadership because they need it, not because they have a great purpose to pursue or something. And then what you're saying to me there about your approach to leadership, and I consider you to be a great leader, but what you're saying there is actually part of the problem, because you're so humble with your leadership that you're not going to be pushing past people to lead, and actually there are going to be many people who look at you and say, oh no, she's far too humble to be a leader. She's not, she doesn't do that sort of, I don't know, whatever it is, the sort of the thumping the table or the game playing or whatever it is that somehow people associate with leadership. How do we change that? How do we get people to understand that great leadership is much closer to what you're talking about than, I don't know, the sort of Hollywood ideal of a strong leader, or I don't know what example I would use, but how do we help people to understand that difference?
Well, I think the work that you're doing is leading the way on this. I think it is actually trying to highlight that there are different forms of leadership, and identifying that we now do need to be celebrating different forms of leadership. As you were talking, I was thinking about Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and the new way she is role modeling leadership, which sounds an awful lot more like the sort of leadership you're describing than some of the strongman leadership that we see. And I'm not trying to turn it into a gender discussion at all. She did come to mind as you were talking about somebody that is going about doing, carving her own path and leading in a different way, which that needs to be celebrated, I think. And we've seen during the COVID pandemic that leadership like that seems to have worked a lot better than the sort of empty rhetoric of the strongman leaders. And maybe this works by osmosis. We just have more of these people, and you don't sound so convinced.
I think it takes intentional action. It takes leadership. It takes intentional action.
Yeah.
But I know you want to be fair about this, but I agree. I think there is a gender difference. I think we do see, right, in global terms, we see more great leadership from women than we do from men. And I think there is a timing thing going on here, which is that sort of strongman leadership, the very hierarchical authority kind of leadership, actually quite a paternalistic kind of leadership, that kind of worked when the problems were relatively simple problems. But you raised the point about wicked problems earlier on, and I think the challenge is that these wicked problems and super wicked problems are now the ones that are existential for us. If you take something like World War II, that was a huge problem, but it wasn't actually a wicked problem. It could, there were very difficult ways of solving it, but they weren't complex. Or, there were a number of actions you needed to take, and if you followed through on those actions, you could solve that problem. Whereas if you take the problem with climate change, that's a wicked problem. We're the ones creating it. That's heavily time bound, all sorts of complexity built into it. And it needs, you can't solve it with that strongman kind of leadership. You can't just order it away. I mean, we've seen it with the pandemic as well. You can't just say, oh no, don't take no notice of that. It doesn't matter. You've got to do difficult things and make difficult choices. And I think what we're seeing, exactly to your point, is that the type of leadership that Jacinda Ardern exemplifies and role models is the type of leadership that solves those wicked problems.
And I've got a question for you though, Neil, but that's about I think where I struggle a little bit with this idea of the more humble leaders coming to the fore is when it comes to social media and the need for having a media presence, and the need for so much is to do with how visible you are. And I'm thinking here about some some people that I hugely admire in the field that I now find myself working in, and they shy away from all of that
Mm.
to do some really excellent work. But that work doesn't get highlighted, or it does, and they themselves don't get feted because by definition they're avoiding that spotlight. And so that in itself is a bit of a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly the vicious cycle. Absolutely. That the very best leaders never get heard of. And
Yeah.
so when the electorate out there are saying, well, who do we want to lead us? The the people who you actually want to be on the ballot box aren't there. Or I mean, some of them are clearly, but not nearly enough.
This,
Um,
this reminds me so much of when the first time I think this occurred to me, but in a different way, would have been 2008 during the banking crisis. And I saw, we saw all these banking chiefs get pulled up in front of the Treasury Select Committee and getting quite rightly grilled on what was going on. And I remember watching one of the first that got pulled in, and I thought, oh my goodness me, I hope that never happens to me in my entire life. And it occurred to me in the same second, I thought somebody is watching this thinking, yeah, bring it on. I just thought someone somewhere would go, yeah, that's what comes with the status of being a leader of some of these big global banks, and it would appeal to them. And I just remember thinking, but that's probably the last person that you'd ever want running one of these big global banks in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And
yeah.
I think we have learned that lesson, I think, in
Yeah.
financial services. Yeah.
But I think our reflection over 20 years is that business has moved a long way, and you meet fantastic leaders in business more and more often nowadays, and the challenge is really in the public sector and in government that we not enough. I mean, there are some fantastic people, absolutely, in government and the public sector, absolutely there are, but there are still too many of the wrong kind of leader, which is part of what we want to try and change. Rhian-Marie, thank you so much for doing this interview. It's absolutely wonderful. I wish you every success.
Thank you, Neil, and for all the support over the years. I really do appreciate a lot of support that I've received from you and from Holos. So thank you.